Okay, welcome back everyone. And let's just keep moving forward now with our next element, which is going to be our magical sort of wispy tendrils that I want to use to fill up this middle space. So let's just start here with a new geo again. And so the thought process here is going to be pretty much similar to what we did with the portal effect. Just see if I can fix my, which is basically all I need is a sphere, and we'll probably place that in the correct location over here, but we just need a sphere to emit some volumetrics out radially all over the environment, and we'll just use that to advect some particles into the environment. So unlike the portal, we don't need to do something flat. We actually want the opposite. We want as spherical a shape as we can get from that volume sim. So I'm just going to start here and actually put down a sphere. It doesn't need to be big. And I'll just go for a bunch of points here. Okay, and the next thing we can do is set a velocity, because we know we want a velocity value pointing outwards. So let's put down a point sop, choose velocity and set that to n. Okay, so at least we have some kind of starting velocity there. And let me see what I can get from our shockwave geometry here. So what do we have? We've also got a sphere, subdivide, rest, color. We don't really need any of that. And inside our animation subnet here, I have this transform. So let's take that and use it here as well. Just to give us our initial general location over there. So that gives us that. We don't need the animation. So that looks good enough. So that can be our source for our volume. So we just need to do a basic volume sim. It doesn't need to be anything special or anything extremely detailed. We won't be rendering that, we'll be rendering the particle advection. So I'm just going to use a pyro shelf tool here. Let's go with billowy smoke. And I'll just leave this in its own .NET there and just delete the other node that's put down. And before we take a look at the sim itself, let's just jump back in here and check that our source looks good. So that's our sphere with the velocity. Here's our new location. Here we have the attributes being generated. So we've got a source smoke and scattering points on the surface. So I could choose volume scatter. I think let's just go with the surface. Just get a few more points in there. So we have density and temperature. I'm going to plug in velocity as well. So that looks good. Then we have our noise. And this is just affecting density and temperature. I could add velocity in. But then this is kind of breaking my, I think this velocity, I'm going to plug in the transform before the point, because that transform was transforming the velocity as well. So let's just leave it like that. And this noise now is really ruining my spherical type velocity that I had. So I could use multiplicative. Let's just take it off. So we keep a perfectly radial V attribute there, but we add some noise to our density and our temperature here. And that is our rasterized points. So we just need, I'm going to go with bigger and less dense. And let's come back to this noise and just add a little bit more detail here. So the basis is we go for something that has lots of small pockets of noise, and then hopefully as we push that volume out, we get lots of interesting individual areas. And it's not a case of making sure that there's a sense of disturbance, but more that there's multiple interesting areas in the volume. Okay, that looks okay for now. Let me go ahead and put down our DOP import. So I just need to keep density and velocity as usual. Let's set our pyro to start at 174. And I'm going to look at this immediately through the camera. Going back to my thoughts and my workflow on whether or not I'm looking at the end result while I'm tweaking values. So it depends on what takes long to visualize. Sometimes it takes longer if you're trying to view the whole scene. But at least for this initial part, I can just include the entire viewport here and just adjust settings in the DOP at the same time. So density, temperature, and velocity. Let's just see how it looks. Ah, okay, I didn't put in our .NET. So there we have it. Not very exciting. Let's jump back in here and do a little bit extra housekeeping. I'm going to increase the padding because I'm about to boost the velocities. Take off the clamp. Let's go a little bit less resolution. And if I come back here, as usual, a few things to consider. One is, if you're experimenting, and just remember our goal here is to try and fill this middle space of our EMP. So everything around the drone with something magical looking. So we need something quite expansive. And depending on how extreme you go up or down on the density, you can get a very different result from the sim. So I'll be adjusting that value. And then obviously let's just go crazy for starters on the velocity. Wow. Okay, so that's so fast, it's just kind of breaking. So as usual, high velocity, we tend to need more sub-steps. Okay, so that's a little bit more like it. It's very flat at the moment. I'm not sure why, but obviously the entire shape of the explosion itself is heavily defined by the noise in the source as well. So we can tweak and try different values in there. I'm going to just for now remove gravity and switch off any buoyancy. So I don't need it to be floating up or down specifically. Okay. So let me try go way down here. And I just compensate with the visualization of the density. Just crank it up if I'm going way down on my source. So it's still pretty flat. So one thing we can try, and before we start to try different noises on the source, is use something else to help maintain the push of this volume outward from the center. So here I've just duplicated the source, and I'll use expand, which also just takes a field and plugs it into divergence. We don't have divergence, but all I need to do is use our density from our source and convert that into divergence. So let's just see what effect that has. I'm not seeing much. Let's just go crazy as well. Yeah, so it's definitely doing something. It's pushing out. And I guess the kind of interesting thing about using that as a force is we get the noise baked in from the source as well. So certain areas of that sphere have more of an impact on this expansion force. So it expands slightly more in some areas, and that noise is being animated as well. So that expansion force is changing over time, which is pretty cool. Another thing to mention just over here is, like I said, we don't really need that much detail. We won't be rendering this volume, so options in the shape settings like this disturbance, we shouldn't need anything super high, because the higher we go and the more detailed we get this volume to look, the more messy and random the particle advection once we get there is going to look. So while we do want some interesting motion to give our particle sim something interesting to look at, if we take that too far, it's actually going to just result in a less good looking particle sim. So I should be focused on more sort of overall turbulent motion and less on high detailed disturbance on the volume sim. So I'm just going to mess around with a few of these turbulence settings quickly. Just go with something like that for now. And in the meantime, before I get too stuck into this part of the effect, let's just make sure that we're stealing our collision object from our dust. So we get the road and the environment in here. So I'll just put down a static object and we'll find our dust collider. And let's put that in the proxy volume here and choose volume sample. Not to forget to plug this in. Okay, so there we go, that's working. So now at least we have something for that super expanding volume to interact with there. I don't need to see it. And something else we can do to kind of enforce this super expansion here is just increase the time scale on our sim as well. Well, we seem to be breaking up that very flat looking sim we had anyway, so let's just have a look at this through the camera. It's pretty low density, so I'll put down a volume ramp here and just boost this up. Okay, that doesn't look too bad, but it has made me think of something. We don't want it to constantly be emitting smoke. And one of the cool things we can do here, based on our sphere animation actually, is just to simulate one good looking volume sim just for a few frames. So we only need to source for, like, say 10 frames. And then we can just use the same sphere anim where we time shifted and merged it back together to produce our 3 separate pulses along the timeline here. So one good volume sim, and then obviously we'll need to introduce a bunch of variation in between those 3 pulses, but we could do that at the particle advection stage as well. So for now, let's just say we need to make one decent short volume sim, and the rest of the timeline will be dealt with later on. So to do that, I am just going to put down a switch and a null, and I'll say, let's just say 183. So $f greater than 183, then switch to the null. Right, so we'll source for about 10 frames there. And let me just go back to that DOP, and in the divergence field I have here, I'll point to the rasterize instead of out density, because I want the divergence field to exist forever and I don't want it to switch off at the same frame as the source. So I'll just point that to before that switch. Okay. So I'm just running through here what we have. Let me do a quick flip book through the camera and we'll see what it looks like. So at the moment, compositionally, I'm just trying to figure out, and if we zoom out, how much space is this taking up, and from this distance, is it making an interesting shape that's going to read well? And it's slightly difficult to judge all of that based on the volume, because obviously I want my particles to be kind of tenderly, leaving sort of thin trails behind. So it's going to be a lot more of a defined shape once we have the particles in, instead of this kind of big puffy cloud. But we can get an idea overall if our turbulence looks good, if our source is working. That's not bad actually. So I might just need to make sure our smoke is living for a bit longer, so I'll reduce the dissipation. Maybe change the scale of our turbulence to see if I can get more exaggerated changes in movement. But overall, that's kind of something like what we want. I can see here there's even volume out to here. So pretty much the particles we should be able to get advected to cover this whole middle section of the frame. Yep. So a few key areas here to tweak and try out and see how interesting you can get the volume. Again, ignoring high detail stuff. It should look very simple and low detail. Key areas is probably how much of the expansion force is affecting the volume. Obviously we've changed our time scale to exaggerate the speed, and then we need to, I'll just drop this down here, need to play with options for turbulence. So I could try larger swirl size to get more exaggerated shapes. Maybe just boost the value of the turbulence itself. Nothing else really to touch in there. One other thing you could do and try a few different sims and flipbooks is just actually take the noise here on our source and add a random offset, because the shape will be drastically different depending on what this noise looks like. So that's a completely different shape. And if we look at that and I just put it back to 0 and reset, we've got something completely different. So it doesn't need to be perfect, but tweak those settings until you're happy with a shape to move forward with. And try not to spend too much time on that, because it's going to look very different again once we start with the particle advection. So let me end this one here for now. That's a pretty good base for our magic sim, and we'll come back in the next video to tackle the particles. So I'll see you then.